When Jacob Stone's innocent sister vanished without a trace, it seemed her fate was sealed. Powerful forces behind her disappearance hid behind authority, robbing people of their last chance at a normal life. But Jacob, driven by rage and despair, found a way not just to find her, but to expose the entire corrupt network behind it all. Discover how this lonely cowboy brought justice and why those responsible finally faced their unexpected retribution. Jacob Stone, more often called Silent in these parts, wasn't like most cowboys of the Wild West. He didn't chase after loud glory, didn't seek gold veins, and didn't spend nights in smoky saloons until dawn. His life was entirely and completely devoted to one person, his younger sister Emily. After their parents passed away from smallpox, Jacob swore to protect Emily, their last and only connection to a peaceful past. He was her whole world, and she was the meaning for which he lived. Their modest but cozy ranch, located on the very outskirts of the small town of Oakwood, served as their refuge, an impregnable fortress against the cruel outside world. But one morning, returning from a long ride inspecting distant pastures, Jacob found an empty house. No note, no slightest sign of a struggle, not even a hint of what had happened. Emily had simply vanished. The initial shock was so piercing and all-encompassing that Jacob barely remained on his feet. It seemed as if the entire world around him froze, then collapsed, engulfing him in a deafening roar of emptiness. He rushed through the rooms, frantically calling her name, but heard only the icy echo of his own despair. Every corner of the house, every familiar object reminded him of her, intensifying the agonizing feeling of loss. Without a moment's delay, he rushed to Oakwood, asking everyone he could find, questioning, pleading, but no one had seen or heard anything. Sheriff Buckner, a portly and surprisingly indifferent man, known for his dislike of strangers and newcomers, merely brushed him off, uttering phrases that cut him to the quick. "Girls often run away in these parts. She'll come back on her own if she wants to, or someone else will find her." The sheriff's words not only failed to reassure him, but ignited a deep anxiety and a growing sense of blatant injustice within Jacob. How could anyone be so indifferent to a child's disappearance? Jacob knew for certain Emily would never run away. He felt deep in his gut that something far more sinister was behind this disappearance, and his intuition screamed of danger. Clenching his teeth, he swore to himself he would find her, no matter the cost, even if he had to turn the entire Wild West upside down. Days imperceptibly flowed into weeks, and then into agonizingly long months. Jacob's search for Emily, despite all his efforts, yielded absolutely no results. He traversed hundreds of miles, crossing the boundless expanses of the Wild West, from dusty, noisy saloons where all sorts of riffraff gathered, to gloomy, dismal mining settlements steeped in hopelessness. Everywhere he showed the only worn photograph of his sister, but met only with indifference or blank stares. He slept under the open sky, covered by an old blanket, ate meager food he managed to scrounge, and greeted each new dawn with a barely flickering hope, and each sunset with increasing pain and overwhelming despair. On his journey, he fought with bandits, dodged flying bullets, avoided deadly traps. But Emily seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving not a single trace. His compassion for her possible suffering was the sole driving force that kept him from giving up. He imagined her all alone, frightened, perhaps in trouble, and that gave him the strength to keep going, without stopping for a moment. In one of the most remote and God-forsaken towns, where chance or desperation had led Jacob, he caught a faint whisper. A whisper about mysterious live goods that occasionally, like ghosts, appeared at underground auctions organized in the most secluded and hidden corners of the Wild West. It was said that these auctions were held for the most influential and repulsive people, willing to pay exorbitant sums for human lives. The stories were vague, full of hints and unspoken words, but Jacob, like a drowning man grasping at a straw, clung to this thread. The most shocking and terrifying part was that all these rumors pointed to Oakwood, his hometown, as one of the possible centers of these vile trades. And everyone who mentioned these auctions glanced uneasily in the direction of Sheriff Buckner. This initially caused Jacob surprise, which quickly turned into chilling fear. Could the sheriff's indifference to Emily's disappearance be more than just negligence or laziness? He felt his heart clench with a cold, terrifying realization. The premonition of disaster that had driven him forward now took on clear, frightening contours. Following the darkest rumors that hung in the air like a foul smoke, Jacob returned to Oakwood. He spent weeks lurking in the shadows, like a nocturnal beast, gathering information bit by bit. He bribed a petty drunk who blabbed carelessly, overheard snippets of conversations in the darkest corners of saloons, and every new detail, like a piece of a gruesome mosaic, formed an unbearable picture. His initial intrigue transformed into chilling horror when he finally learned the exact location and time of the next auction. It was an old, almost completely abandoned warehouse on the very outskirts of town, a place that, ironically or by sinister design, Sheriff Buckner himself often used for storing confiscated goods. On the appointed night, Jacob, driven by desperate determination, crept towards the warehouse. Through the cracks in the rotten walls, a dim, flickering light shone, and from inside came drunken voices and loud, disgusting laughter. After squeezing inside through a hole in the dilapidated roof, he saw something that made his blood run cold and his heart skip a beat. In the center of the filthy hall stood a makeshift stage, built from rough planks, and on it, a cage, a small wooden cage, as if meant for a wild animal. And in that cage, with bound hands and a completely terror-stricken gaze, sat Emily. His Emily. When she raised her eyes, full of primal horror and silent plea, the world around Jacob narrowed, collapsing into this single, monstrous image. The shock was so overwhelming, so unbearable, that he nearly fainted, nearly fell from the rafters. His own sister, his only family, his innocent Emily, was being put up for sale, like soulless merchandise, like a voiceless animal. And the most terrifying, most repulsive part was that this vile auction was being conducted by Sheriff Buckner himself. His face was contorted with a disgusting, predatory smirk as he pounded his gavel, announcing bids as if he were trading cattle, not a human life. Rage engulfed Jacob, transforming into a wild, uncontrollable roar caught in his throat. This wasn't just anger, it was the fury of a wounded, cornered beast. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, every muscle tensed, with an overwhelming urge to jump down and tear that man apart, to stomp him into the ground. Sheriff Buckner, beneath the badge of the law, was not merely an indifferent official or a lazy representative of authority. He was a monster, trafficking in human lives, and his own sister had become his victim. In that moment, Jacob fully realized that his search was over, but an entirely different battle had begun, a battle for retribution. The seconds Jacob hung on the beam felt like an eternity, filled with the unbearable roar of his fury. Finally, with a cry that could drown out a bull's bellow, he leaped directly onto the makeshift stage, landing precisely between Sheriff Buckner and Emily's cage. The grip of his revolver found his hand even before his feet touched the creaking floorboards. The auction hall instantly plunged into chaos. The terrified crowd, composed of vile traffickers and their accomplices, scattered in every direction, leaving the sheriff and his trembling henchmen alone with the enraged cowboy who was literally ablaze with fury. What does this mean, Stone? This is rebellion, Buckner croaked, trying to draw his Colt. But Jacob was faster. He didn't fire immediately. His goal wasn't just revenge, but a complete public exposure of this monster. He aimed the revolver at the sheriff, keeping him at gunpoint. You thought you'd hide behind a badge, Buckner? You were wrong. This girl is my sister, and for what you've done to her, you'll answer to the whole town. Jacob forced the sheriff at gunpoint to confess his repulsive crimes in front of the few remaining witnesses who hadn't managed to flee in panic. One of Buckner's henchmen, seeing his boss caught, tried to intervene, but Jacob put him down with a single, precise, stunning blow before he could even move. By the time the old, slow deputy sheriff finally arrived, drawn by the noise and shouts, Buckner was already bound, and Emily trembled in her brother's strong embrace. Her face was wet with tears, but in her eyes, despite the horror she had endured, a flicker of hope appeared. Jacob handed the deputy irrefutable evidence he had gathered for weeks, risking his life. Records of illicit dealings, letters from accomplices, even testimonies from other victims who had lived in fear and silence for years, afraid to speak. 2. News of Sheriff Buckner's exposure and his filthy auctions spread across the Wild West like wildfire. Jacob's triumph was complete and undeniable. Buckner was tried, found guilty on all counts, and sent to federal prison, where he rotted away, forgotten by everyone. Oakwood gained a new, honest sheriff who quickly restored order. Jacob and Emily returned to their ranch, which was now not just their home, but a symbol of their unbreakable spirit and will to live. In Jacob's eyes, there was no longer despair, only a quiet, deep satisfaction. He had brought justice not only for his beloved sister, but also for all those whom this corrupt lawman had tried to break. Their story became a true legend, proving that even in the darkest and most forgotten corners of the Wild West, there is always a place for true justice.